who was the woman who ruled an empire, not with a crown of gold, but with a veil of intrigue. For centuries, history books have whispered tales of kings and emperors, but what about the queens, the forgotten pharaohs, and the warrior women who shaped ancient civilizations? Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and let's uncover the astonishing stories of female rulers whose power rivaled any man's. History often presents itself as a well-organized story, where the powerful are remembered and the forgotten are presumed unimportant. Yet this illusion begins to fade when one notices how many women who once ruled vast empires or influenced the fate of nations have nearly disappeared from memory. It is common to think of Cleopatra when imagining a powerful queen from the ancient world, but this is only because her story survived through Roman writers and later dramatizations. Behind her, there exists an entire shadow archive of women who ruled with intelligence, courage, and strategy equal to or greater than their male counterparts, yet their names seldom appear in the pages of mainstream history. The quiet absence of these figures is not an accident of time, but a result of how stories of power were shaped and who was allowed to tell them. Centuries of chroniclers, priests, and scholars built the world's official memory. They often wrote under kings or emperors, shaping records that praised male rulers while minimizing the authority of women. When a woman did rise to power, her story was often twisted into something unnatural or scandalous. She was described as a temptress, a witch, or a usurper rather than a capable sovereign. This pattern began early and persisted through empires, religions, and revolutions. It created a misleading belief that women rarely ruled, and when they did, they were exceptions to the rule rather than active participants in governance. Yet the truth is far more complex. There were dozens of female monarchs who commanded armies, built cities, wrote laws, and managed diplomacy in ways that shaped civilizations. Long before Cleopatra, Egypt saw another woman sit on the throne as pharaoh. Hatshepsut ruled more than 1,000 years earlier, and her reign was one of prosperity and architectural innovation. She built great temples, extended trade networks, and managed a long era of peace. She dressed in the traditional symbols of kingship, including the royal beard, not out of vanity, but to assert her legitimacy in a world that defined leadership through masculine imagery. After her death, her successor attempted to erase her name from monuments and records. Statues were smashed, and her image was chiseled out of walls. For centuries, she remained a ghost in Egyptian history until archaeologists pieced her legacy together from fragments. Her near erasure shows how deliberate historical silence can be. A ruler who brought stability and wealth to Egypt was almost lost because her gender challenged the accepted story of what power should look like. The same pattern appears in other cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, a woman named Kababa once ruled the city of Kish, one of the oldest known examples of a female monarch. She appears briefly in the Sumerian king list, an early record of rulers written on clay tablets. The document acknowledges her as a king, not a queen, implying that her rule was legitimate and recognized. Yet she remains a footnote in most modern retellings of early civilization, overshadowed by male kings who came after her. In the same region centuries later, Semiramis of Assyria became a legendary figure whose real deeds blurred with myth. Ancient writers credited her with building Babylon's Great Walls and leading campaigns across Asia. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, they reflect the memory of a woman whose power was extraordinary enough to become legend. Still, over time, she too became distorted, turned into a symbol of vanity and lust by later chroniclers who found a powerful woman threatening. The idea that female rulers were rare is one of history's most persistent myths. In truth, almost every part of the world produced women who governed either directly or through influence. The difficulty lies in how their stories were transmitted. When a king dies, records of his reign are preserved because his successors and subjects have reasons to maintain his legacy. When a queen rules, especially in a patriarchal society, her memory often depends on whether later rulers choose to honor her. Many did not. Some actively removed her from public memory, seeing her as a political inconvenience. The result is a patchwork of forgotten queens and empresses whose contributions had to be rediscovered by modern historians centuries later. In ancient China, one of the most remarkable rulers was Wu Zetian. She began as a concubine during the Tang dynasty and rose through skill and intellect to become the only woman to claim the title of emperor in her own right. Her reign saw administrative reform, expansion of the empire's influence, and support for education and the arts. Yet after her death, Male historians portrayed her as manipulative and cruel, focusing on rumored assassinations and palace intrigues while downplaying her accomplishments. This pattern is familiar. When women ruled successfully, their achievements were reinterpreted as moral failings. Wu Zetian's political maneuvering was no different from that of male emperors, yet her gender turned her into a villain in the official record. A similar story unfolds in Japan with Empress Suko, who ruled during the early 7th century. She helped introduce Buddhism as a state religion and stabilized the nation through careful diplomacy. Despite her long and stable reign, later histories focused more on her male advisors and family members, reducing her to a background figure. In Korea, Queen Seondeok of Silla led during a period of great cultural and scientific growth. She supported the building of astronomical observatories and temples and strengthened her kingdom's unity. Even in regions that followed strict patriarchal traditions, these rulers demonstrated that leadership was not confined to one gender. Moving westward, one encounters the queens of Africa, whose reigns defy the European notion that power in the ancient world was almost entirely male. In the kingdom of Kush, which neighbored ancient Egypt, several queens known as the Kandakes ruled as warrior monarchs. They led armies, signed treaties, and resisted foreign invasions. One Kandake, Amanirenas, famously fought against the Romans after the fall of Cleopatra's Egypt. She inflicted significant damage on Roman forces and negotiated a peace treaty that preserved her kingdom's autonomy. Yet her story is barely taught outside academic circles, overshadowed by the Roman accounts that glorified their own leaders. Another African ruler, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, in what is now Angola, commanded armies against Portuguese colonization in the 17th century. She used diplomacy and guerrilla tactics to protect her people's independence. European records portrayed her as savage or deceitful, but modern historians recognize her as a brilliant strategist. In Europe, too, the hidden reigns continue. Before England's Elizabeth I, there was Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, who ruled part of England during the early 10th century. She led military campaigns against Viking invaders and governed with intelligence and strength during a chaotic period. Despite her success, chroniclers later credited her achievements to her male relatives, reducing her role to that of an assistant rather than a ruler. Centuries later, when Elizabeth I ascended the throne, she faced the same skepticism about a woman's ability to rule. Yet she built one of the most stable and prosperous reigns in English history. Even so, much of the narrative around her still emphasizes her decision not to marry or her feminine qualities, rather than her skillful governance. The same selective memory appears in the Mediterranean world beyond Cleopatra. In the Hellenistic era, several queens ruled or co-ruled powerful kingdoms. Arsinoe II of Egypt, for example, influenced trade and diplomacy in the Ptolemaic Empire and was deified after her death. In the Seleucid Empire, queens like Laotse I wielded great authority behind the throne. Yet their stories are seldom told, even though their political marriages and strategic alliances shaped the course of the region. The Roman world itself saw influential women, from Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, who quietly managed imperial politics, to Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, who navigated a dangerous court environment. Ancient historians often described them as scheming or overambitious, unable to imagine female ambition as anything but moral corruption. Farther east, in the Indian subcontinent, there were women whose reigns challenged expectations. Razia Sultan, who ruled Delhi in the 13th century, broke barriers by ascending the throne in a Muslim kingdom that did not recognize women as rulers. She dressed in men's clothes not to disguise herself, but to embody the authority associated with kingship. Her short reign was marked by administrative reform and military skill, but conservative nobles rebelled against her gender, leading to her downfall. In South India, rulers like Rudrama Devi governed powerful kingdoms, leading armies and overseeing vast territories. Their achievements were preserved in inscriptions and local traditions, but rarely reached global awareness. In Southeast Asia, rulers such as Queen Tribhuvan Wijaya Tung Gadwi of Majapahit in Indonesia oversaw one of the largest empires in the region's history. Her leadership brought economic growth and territorial expansion. Similarly, in Cambodia, Queen Jayara Gadwi and her sister Indradevi played major roles in governance and religious reform during the Khmer Empire. Yet their contributions have often been eclipsed by the fame of male rulers like Jayavarman. The recurring theme remains that women's power, even when visible in their own time, was often hidden by later interpretations. In the Americas, long before European arrival, women also held positions of influence. Among the Mayans, queens such as Lady Six Sky led military campaigns and managed city-states. In the Andean civilizations, women served as priestesses and rulers within matrilineal systems that valued their spiritual and political roles. The later Inca Empire maintained powerful female figures known as Coya, who ruled alongside the emperor and managed key religious duties. When Spanish colonizers recorded these societies, they misunderstood or ignored the balance of gendered power that existed there, viewing everything through a patriarchal European lens. Thus, an entire hemisphere's examples of female rule were largely erased in the global narrative of governance. The problem of erasure did not end in antiquity. Even in more recent centuries, women who exercised authority were often reframed as anomalies. Catherine the Great of Russia, for example, expanded her empire, reformed administration, and encouraged the arts and education. Yet her memory is burdened with gossip and scandal rather than recognition of her political genius. Maria Theresa of Austria ruled a vast and complex empire while navigating constant wars and male opposition. Her reforms in taxation, education, and military organization reshaped Central Europe, but her story is often overshadowed by that of her famous son Joseph. In the Islamic world, rulers like Shajarat al-Dur of Egypt briefly held the throne during the Crusades, proving capable in leadership but later erased from chronicles that refused to acknowledge a woman's legitimacy. Across continents and centuries, the pattern is consistent. Women in power were not rare. They were systematically forgotten. Their erasure was both deliberate and convenient. It allowed later generations to maintain a simple story about leadership as a male domain. It also made it easier to justify restricting women from politics, property, or education by claiming they lacked historical precedent. This illusion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people looked for examples of female rulers, they found few because the records had been altered or lost, reinforcing the belief that such rulers had never existed. Modern scholarship has begun to challenge this distortion by returning to original sources, re-examining artifacts, and questioning long-accepted narratives. Archaeologists uncover inscriptions that mention queens once thought to be myth. Linguists and historians reinterpret texts where a ruler's name was deliberately changed to appear masculine. The rediscovery of these stories does more than fill gaps in the record. It reshapes our understanding of power itself. It shows that leadership has always been more diverse than traditional history allows. It also reveals how cultural bias can survive for thousands of years, shaping what each generation believes about gender and capability. One striking feature of these hidden reigns is the variety of leadership styles they reveal. Some queens ruled through diplomacy, others through warfare, and many through a balance of both. Their approaches often reflected their society's expectations, yet they also redefined them. Hatshepsut's architectural achievements projected stability and divine order. Wu Zetian used bureaucratic reform to centralize authority. Nzinga of Ndongo used diplomacy as a weapon as sharp as any sword. Elizabeth I mastered image and language to maintain control over a divided court. Each of these women found ways to adapt the structures of power that were designed to exclude them. They did not simply imitate male rulers, they reimagined authority on their own terms. The erasure of their legacies also reveals how deeply storytelling shapes identity. The chroniclers who dismissed these women were not merely reporting events, they were defining what power looked like. By making male rule the norm, they set a standard that later historians and educators would repeat unconsciously. The result is that even today, when students learn about ancient or medieval history, they can often name dozens of kings, but only a few queens. This imbalance is not due to lack of evidence, but to centuries of repetition. Once a narrative becomes established, it resists change because it feels familiar and natural. Challenging it requires both evidence and imagination. Recovering these stories is not about revising history to fit modern ideals. It is about restoring accuracy. The idea that power belongs to one gender has never been historically true. The record shows that when circumstances demanded leadership, women stepped forward, whether as pharaohs, emperors, or tribal chiefs. They governed successfully, and when they failed for the same reasons as men: political rivalry, economic hardship, or military defeat. What makes their stories unique is not their gender, but the effort required to bring them back into view. Every recovered queen is a reminder that history is not a fixed truth, but a living conversation between the past and those who study it. In examining these hidden reigns, one also sees how societies remembered or forgot them for political reasons. When later rulers wanted to present themselves as restorers of order, they erased predecessors who did not fit their image. When religion dictated male authority, it became convenient to pretend that women had never ruled. In this way, memory became a tool of control. Monuments were destroyed, chronicles rewritten, and names deliberately misspelled to break the chain of remembrance. It is a quiet form of censorship that has shaped how civilizations understand their own past. Yet despite the centuries of silence, the evidence of these rulers endures. It lives in temple walls, coins, and oral traditions. In some cases, it survives through the very attempts to erase it. The chisel marks on Hatshepsut's statues or the defaced inscriptions of Wu Zetian's name testify to their existence more powerfully than praise ever could. Their resilience in memory mirrors their resilience in life. Each of these women ruled in defiance of systems built to exclude them, and in doing so, they expanded the possibilities of leadership for those who followed. The rediscovery of these stories challenges not only historical assumptions, but also modern perceptions. It asks us to reconsider what we mean by power. If power is the ability to shape events, inspire loyalty, or build enduring institutions, then women have always been part of that story. Their exclusion from the record says more about the storytellers than about the rulers themselves. Recognizing them does not diminish the achievements of men. It enriches the narrative of humanity by making it complete. It shows that leadership is a shared human capacity, not a privilege of one group. When we think of Cleopatra, we imagine a woman of beauty, intellect, and tragedy, whose life ended in defiance of Rome. Her fame endures partly because her story fits into a dramatic pattern that appeals to later cultures. But behind her stands a long line of queens who shaped the world as profoundly as she did, often without recognition. From the deserts of Nubia to the palaces of China, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the castles of medieval Europe, these rulers governed with vision and strength. Their names may not be household words, but their influence still lingers in the languages, borders, and traditions that define nations today. To bring them back into the light is not merely to honor forgotten individuals, but to correct a long-standing distortion in how humanity views its own history. The belief that women rarely ruled is a myth created by omission. The truth is that they ruled often, and when they did, they left marks that time could not completely erase. Every rediscovered queen reminds us that history is not just a record of what happened, but also of what was chosen to be remembered. The hidden reigns beyond Cleopatra show that power, intelligence, and courage have never belonged to one gender. They belong to all who dare to lead, even when the world tries to forget them. Hatshepsut's story begins not in the grand proclamations of a queen destined for greatness, but in the quiet halls of a royal palace where she was born a daughter rather than a son. In the long line of Egyptian dynasties, birth order mattered, but gender mattered even more. She was born into privilege, yet in a world that believed kingship was a divine right given only to men, her path to power required more than noble blood. It demanded vision, courage, and a deep understanding of how symbols and stories could shape reality. Hatshepsut did not inherit the throne in the traditional sense. She built it around herself, piece by piece, until her rule appeared as natural and inevitable as the rising sun over the Nile. Her ascent began as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose, who was too young to govern. At first, she ruled in his name, presenting herself as a caretaker of the kingdom's continuity. But Egypt was a land where image was inseparable from authority, and Hatshepsut understood that power had to be seen to be believed. Over time, she began to appear in inscriptions and carvings not merely as a regent, but as a ruler in her own right. The titles of kingship, once reserved for men, began to follow her name. Her coronation was an act of extraordinary boldness, not only because she claimed the throne as a woman, but because she did so without open rebellion or civil war. She achieved what few could imagine. She made the impossible appear orderly and legitimate. To do this, Hatshepsut turned to the tools that every successful ruler of Egypt understood: religion, art, and architecture. She claimed divine endorsement from the god Ammonius, asserting that he had chosen her to rule as his earthly representative. In temple reliefs, she commissioned scenes depicting the god himself visiting her mother in the form of her father, thus giving divine birth to Hatshepsut. This narrative of divine conception was not new, but its application to a woman was revolutionary. It transformed her gender from a liability into a sacred sign of destiny. By aligning her reign with divine will, she left no room for debate about her legitimacy. Her subjects were not merely following a woman on the throne, they were obeying the living daughter of a god. Her propaganda was sophisticated, calculated, and deeply effective. Hatshepsut filled Egypt's temples and monuments with imagery that merged her identity with that of traditional male kingship. She wore the royal beard, the Nemes headdress, and the kilt of a pharaoh. Yet she also retained feminine features in some depictions, blending both roles into a single, unified image of authority. This visual duality was a masterstroke of communication. It spoke to a society deeply rooted in ritual and symbolism, reassuring priests and officials that the cosmic order, known as Ma'at, remained intact under her rule. Through art and inscription, she built not only monuments of stone but also monuments of belief. Her image became the architecture of her power. The physical architecture of her reign was no less impressive. Hatshepsut's building program surpassed that of many male rulers before her. Her most famous creation, the temple at Deir el-Bahari, remains one of the architectural marvels of ancient Egypt. Rising in terraces against the cliffs of western Thebes, it was both a political statement and a spiritual masterpiece. The temple's design reflected harmony between human craftsmanship and the natural world, symbolizing her ability to bring balance and order to the realm. Reliefs within its walls tell stories not of conquest, but of prosperity, divine favor, and peace. They depict her divine birth, her coronation, and her achievements as ruler, creating a visual narrative that intertwined her life with the fate of Egypt itself. Beyond architecture, Hatshepsut revitalized Egypt's economy through ambitious trade expeditions. Among the most celebrated was her expedition to the land of Punt, a region thought to be located near modern Eritrea or Somalia. Egyptian inscriptions describe the journey in vivid detail. Ships laden with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals sailing down the Red Sea. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show scenes of Punt's people welcoming the Egyptians and exchanging goods in peaceful cooperation. The mission was not simply about wealth, it was about vision. By reopening trade routes that had fallen silent, Hatshepsut projected Egypt's reach beyond its borders and restored a sense of divine abundance. In doing so, she transformed the image of kingship from one of warlike domination to one of flourishing order. Her reign, by every measure available, was one of stability and success. She maintained peace within Egypt, secured its borders, and oversaw a flourishing of art and architecture. Temples, obelisks, and monuments across the land bore her mark, all proclaiming her divine right and benevolent rule. Yet her power rested on a fragile balance. Though she ruled as a pharaoh, she still occupied a role that challenged deeply ingrained traditions. Her ability to maintain authority depended on her control of narrative and image. As long as her version of history held, her rule would endure. But after her death, when those who succeeded her had their own claims to secure, that same narrative became a threat. It is here that Hatshepsut's story takes a darker turn. Her stepson, Thutmose, who eventually took full power, began a campaign to erase her from memory. Her statues were smashed, her name chiseled out of inscriptions, and her images defaced. This was not an act of simple vengeance, but a deliberate rewriting of history. By removing her from the official record, her successors could present an unbroken line of male rule, restoring the illusion that her reign had never interrupted the divine order of kingship. Her monuments were defaced with precision, suggesting an organized effort rather than random destruction. In the ancient world, to erase a name was to deny existence itself. The Egyptians believed that memory was a form of immortality, and by destroying her name, her enemies sought to kill her twice, once in life's aftermath and once in history's memory. For many centuries, that erasure was effective. Hatshepsut's reign vanished from the known dynastic record, and her monuments were either destroyed or misattributed. It was only in the modern age, through archaeology and scholarship, that her story was pieced together again. When her temple at Deir el-Bahari was excavated and studied, the scale and elegance of her vision astonished historians. Her inscriptions, though damaged, revealed the words of a ruler confident in her destiny and proud of her accomplishments. Slowly, her name returned to light, her image restored from fragments, and her place in history reclaimed. The question that lingers is why her successors went to such lengths to erase her. The answer lies partly in the politics of legitimacy. Thutmose and his descendants needed to reinforce the principle of male succession to protect their own claims. A powerful precedent of female kingship threatened the delicate balance of Egypt's dynastic structure. To admit that a woman had ruled successfully as pharaoh was to open the door for others to do the same. The erasure of Hatshepsut, therefore, was not just personal, it was institutional. It was an attempt to seal a crack in the foundation of patriarchal power before it widened. Yet time has a way of undoing even the most thorough efforts at silence. Today, Hatshepsut stands as one of the most extraordinary rulers in human history, not only for what she achieved, but for how she achieved it. Her legacy speaks to the power of vision and the resilience of truth. Her story shows that propaganda, often dismissed as deceit, can also be a form of creative genius when used to reshape the world's understanding of what is possible. She understood that leadership is as much about narrative as it is about command. By telling a story in which a woman could be both divine and sovereign, she redefined the language of power itself. The significance of Hatshepsut's reign reaches far beyond the boundaries of ancient Egypt. It challenges assumptions about who is allowed to lead and how societies remember their leaders. Her life demonstrates that power is not merely seized. It is constructed through belief, image, and communication. She turned every symbol that once excluded her into a weapon of legitimacy. The beard of kingship, the masculine title, the divine narrative, all became parts of her identity as ruler. In doing so, she proved that the structures of authority, though ancient and sacred, could still be rewritten by human will. Modern historians now view her reign as one of innovation rather than anomaly. Her architectural achievements continue to inspire admiration not only for their scale, but for their conceptual brilliance. The temple at Deir el-Bahari was not built merely to glorify a ruler. It was designed to connect heaven and earth, divine and mortal, male and female. Its terraces, rising in geometric precision against the cliffs, mirror the layers of meaning in her reign, each level revealing a deeper integration of art, faith, and politics. The walls speak of a ruler who saw beauty not as decoration, but as order made visible. Through her buildings, she created a landscape of permanence, a kingdom etched into stone. Her economic policies were equally visionary. By reopening trade routes, strengthening agriculture, and investing in monumental construction, she secured prosperity without constant warfare. Her reign suggests an alternative model of leadership, one grounded not in conquest, but in creation. She demonstrated that stability could be achieved through cooperation, and greatness could be built not on bloodshed but on vision. In the context of her time, this was radical. Egypt's identity had long been tied to military expansion, yet Hatshepsut's era proved that peace could be as powerful a legacy as her self-presentation also reveals a deeper understanding of human psychology. She knew that authority required more than divine claim. It demanded consistency of image. Every inscription, every statue, every architectural detail reinforced her role as pharaoh. There was no confusion, no ambiguity. By controlling how she was seen, she controlled how she was remembered, until her successors intervened. This mastery of perception anticipates techniques used by rulers across history, from Roman emperors to modern statesmen. Hatshepsut's reign thus marks not only a political milestone, but an early chapter in the story of how image and power intertwine. In understanding her legacy, one must also acknowledge the cost of her erasure. When her name was struck from history, Egypt lost more than a ruler. It lost an example of what leadership could be. The absence of her story reinforced the illusion that women could not govern, shaping perceptions for generations. Only through her rediscovery did the narrative begin to shift again. Her restoration to history reminds us that the act of remembering is itself a form of justice. Every recovered statue, every translated inscription, reclaims a piece of truth stolen by time and politics. Today, Hatshepsut's life holds lessons that remain relevant. Her ability to navigate tradition while transforming it speaks to the universal challenge of leadership. She did not reject the symbols of her culture. She reinterpreted them to serve a broader vision. Her reign shows that progress does not always come through rebellion. Sometimes it comes through mastery of the existing order. By becoming both the guardian and the innovator of Egyptian tradition, she left behind a model of power that transcends gender and era. Her legacy invites reflection on how societies define legitimacy and how easily those definitions can exclude the very people capable of renewal. Her rediscovery has also deepened our understanding of ancient Egypt itself. It reveals a civilization more flexible and complex than once believed. The fact that a woman could ascend to the throne, even under extraordinary circumstances, suggests that Egyptian culture valued competence as well as lineage. The priests who served her, the officials who obeyed her, and the artists who carved her image all participated in an experiment that briefly expanded the boundaries of what was possible. Though later generations sought to close those boundaries again, the evidence of her success remains carved in stone. Hatshepsut's dynasty, though obscured for centuries, continues to influence how historians read the past. Her reign encourages a re-examination of other forgotten figures, queens, regents, and leaders whose stories may lie buried beneath layers of political revision. It also serves as a reminder that history is not simply what happened, but what survives of what happened. Every monument, every inscription, every piece of art is both a record and an argument, a claim to memory. In that sense, Hatshepsut's greatest monument is not her temple, but her persistence in the human imagination. Despite the chisel marks of those who sought to silence her, she endures as a symbol of resilience and vision. To understand why her story matters today, one must see it not merely as a tale of ancient ambition, but as a reflection of the timeless struggle for recognition. Her erasure mirrors the countless ways in which societies have silenced voices that did not fit the preferred narrative. Her rediscovery, in turn, represents the ongoing effort to restore balance to the story of humanity. Each generation that studies her adds another layer of understanding, ensuring that she will never again be lost to oblivion. Through her, we learn that the past is not fixed. It is something we continually rebuild, much like the monuments she left behind. Hatshepsut's reign stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns of how easily power can manipulate memory, and it inspires by showing how truth can survive even centuries of deliberate destruction. Her legacy reminds us that greatness is not confined to those who inherit authority, but belongs to those who shape it with purpose and vision. In reclaiming her story, we do more than honor one woman. We restore a missing chapter of human history. We acknowledge that leadership, creativity, and resilience know no gender. We affirm that the architects of empire come in many forms, and that among them stands a woman who built with such mastery that even the effort to erase her could not succeed. The stones of Deir el-Bahari still rise against the desert cliffs, catching the morning sun just as they did in her time. The inscriptions that once proclaimed her divine birth still whisper through their faded lines. The name that was once erased has been carved again into the record of the world. Hatshepsut lives not only in the monuments she built, but in the idea she embodied. That power, when guided by vision, can transcend the limits imposed by convention. Her dynasty may have been forgotten, but her spirit endures as a reminder that history, like the temple she raised, can always be rebuilt from the ruins of silence. The story of lost queens and silenced rulers does not end in the sunlit temples of Egypt. Beyond the deserts and the golden monuments, another land lay under a very different sky, where mist and rain shaped the hills and forests. It was a place Rome considered wild and uncivilized, a distant province at the edge of the known world. This was Britannia, a territory that would one day become a symbol of both resistance and conquest. Among its scattered tribes and ancient woods lived a woman whose fury would shake the empire to its core, a queen whose name would survive centuries of forgetting. Just as Hatshepsut's silence had been carved by power, Boudica's roar would rise from oppression. Where one queen built an empire through peace and persuasion, another would burn one in righteous vengeance. When Rome invaded Britain under Emperor Claudius, the legions brought with them more than weapons. They brought a new order that demanded submission. For a time, the tribes of the island tried to coexist with the conquerors. Alliances were made, hostages exchanged, and local kings allowed to rule as clients of Rome. Among these tribes were the Iceni, whose lands lay in the eastern plains. Their king, Prasutagus, accepted Rome's authority but kept a fragile peace by leaving his kingdom to his two daughters and the emperor jointly in his will. It was a diplomatic gesture meant to preserve his people's independence within the imperial structure. But when Prasutagus died, Rome ignored his wishes. The Roman governor, seeking to assert control, seized the Iceni's land, confiscated property, and enslaved the royal family. Soldiers whipped the queen, Boudica, and violated her daughters. The outrage ignited a fury that no Roman calculation could have anticipated. Britannia under Rome was a land in transition. Roman towns rose beside ancient sacred groves, and roads cut through tribal territories. Yet beneath the surface of apparent order, resentment brewed. Taxes were heavy, Roman creditors ruthless, and the local elite often divided between loyalty and survival. The humiliation of Boudica was not just a personal tragedy. It was an insult to every tribe that had suffered under Roman arrogance. Word spread quickly across the countryside, and soon the Iceni queen became the focus of a rebellion that would unite peoples who had once fought each other. In her, they saw not only vengeance but liberation. Her charisma and determination transformed despair into a movement. Contemporary Roman writers described her as tall, fierce, and commanding, with hair that flowed like a river of fire. Whether these details are true or shaped by later imagination, they capture her presence as a leader who embodied both wrath and authority. Unlike the polished rulers of Rome, Boudica drew her legitimacy from raw emotion and collective memory. She invoked the gods of the land, the ancestors who had defended it, and the freedom that her people had lost. Her speeches, recorded and reimagined through Roman eyes, reveal a deep sense of justice. She spoke of betrayal, of the violation of women, and the desecration of sacred customs. For her followers, the rebellion was not merely a war. It was a cleansing fire meant to burn away the corruption of foreign rule. When the uprising began, it spread like a storm. The first target was Camulogenum, a Roman colony that symbolized everything the conquerors stood for. Built on the site of an old tribal stronghold, it housed Roman veterans and temples dedicated to the emperor. To the Britons, it was a daily reminder of subjugation. Boudica's forces descended upon it with overwhelming force. The city's defenses were weak, its garrison small, and its citizens unprepared for such fury. The settlement burned, its temple besieged, and those within were slaughtered. The destruction was total, a message carved in flame. Roman accounts described the massacre in tones of horror, but to the Britons, it was justice long delayed. From Camulogenum, Boudica's army moved swiftly toward Londinium, the growing center of Roman trade and administration. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was away leading a campaign in Wales, and the local forces were too few to defend the city. Realizing he could not hold it, Suetonius withdrew, leaving the population to flee or face the rebels. When Boudica arrived, Londinium met the same fate as Camulogenum. The city was razed, its buildings reduced to ash, and its inhabitants cut down. The fire was so intense that centuries later, archaeologists would find a distinct layer of red and black earth beneath modern London, known as the Boudican destruction layer. The rebellion then advanced to Verulamium, another Roman settlement, which also fell to the same merciless vengeance. By the time Suetonius regrouped his forces, tens of thousands of Roman citizens and allies had perished, and the province lay in chaos. Boudica's victories were not born of chance. She understood the terrain and the power of unity. Her army, though composed of tribes with different customs, shared a single purpose: to expel the Romans and reclaim their land. They used mobility and overwhelming numbers to crush isolated garrisons and settlements. The Romans, accustomed to disciplined formations and fortified positions, struggled to adapt to the sudden, fluid warfare of the rebels. For a brief and glorious moment, it seemed as if the mighty empire could be driven from Britain altogether. Yet power, as history has often shown, is a fragile balance between courage and control. While Boudica's rebellion achieved astonishing early success, it lacked the logistical discipline and strategic organization of Rome's legions. The Roman governor, hardened by years of command, understood that patience would be his greatest weapon. He gathered his troops, recalled scattered detachments, and chose the battlefield carefully. The final confrontation took place in a location still debated by historians, perhaps along the old Roman road known as Waddling Street. Suetonius positioned his men in a narrow valley, protected by woods behind them and open ground before. The terrain would prevent the vast numbers of the Britons from surrounding his forces. When Boudica's army arrived, it was immense. Her followers had grown into the hundreds of thousands, a vast, impassioned host of warriors, families, and chariots. They carried their loved ones in wagons behind them, believing that the gods would grant them victory and that they would witness the Romans' destruction. The scene must have been both awe-inspiring and tragic. Boudica, standing in her chariot, addressed her people one last time. She invoked the gods of freedom, denounced Roman cruelty, and vowed never to live in bondage. Her words stirred the masses, but the Romans waited in silence, their shields locked, their discipline unbroken. When the Britons charged, their numbers became their weakness. The narrow field funneled them into a bottleneck, and the Roman legions advanced with deadly precision. Their javelins tore through the first ranks, and their compact formations cut deep into the chaotic waves of attackers. The Britons fought bravely, but courage alone could not overcome iron discipline. As the Roman line pressed forward, panic spread among the rebels. Their wagons, which had been placed at the rear as a symbol of confidence, now trapped them in a deadly enclosure. The battle turned into a massacre. By its end, the rebellion that had nearly toppled an empire was crushed beneath Roman steel. Boudica's fate after the defeat remains uncertain. Some accounts say she took poison to avoid capture, while others suggest she fell ill and died soon after. Her burial place, if it ever existed, has never been found. Yet even in death, she refused to vanish. The Romans may have won the field, but they could not destroy the memory of the queen who defied them. Over time, her story passed through the generations, transformed by legend and retold by poets, chroniclers, and patriots. To the Romans, she became a cautionary tale about rebellion. To the Britons, she became a symbol of resistance. Where Hatshepsut's silence was imposed by erasure, Boudica's memory survived through fire. The rebellion's aftermath was brutal. Rome tightened its control, rebuilt its towns, and imposed heavier oversight on the province. Yet even as the empire reasserted its dominance, it could not fully extinguish the spirit that Boudica had awakened. Her uprising revealed the limits of Roman power, the fact that fear could never substitute for respect. For generations, the tribes of Britain remembered her not as a defeated rebel, but as a queen who had dared to stand against the greatest empire of her age. Her defiance became a part of the landscape itself, whispered in the hills and forests where she once rode. Centuries later, when the Roman legions withdrew from Britain, leaving behind their crumbling walls and fading authority, her legend remained. During the medieval period, chroniclers rediscovered her name, though often distorted into variations like Boudica or Boudica. The rediscovery came at a time when England itself was defining its identity, and her story fit the growing sense of native pride. By the Renaissance, she was celebrated as a figure of national resistance. Poets and historians alike invoked her as the spirit of the island, the embodiment of defiance against tyranny. When England later faced foreign threats, her name re-emerged as a rallying cry. In the Age of Empire, when Britain itself became a conquering power, her image took on new layers of meaning. The Victorians erected statues of her, the most famous standing near Westminster Bridge in London. There she rides in her chariot, her daughters beside her, horses rearing toward the sky. The bronze figure faces the Houses of Parliament, a reminder that even in the heart of empire, the spirit of rebellion can never be fully silenced. To some, she became a symbol of national pride. To others, a warning about the cost of vengeance. Her story has been retold countless times, adapted to every era's needs, yet its essence remains unchanged, a cry for justice, born from the ashes of oppression. What makes Boudica's story endure is not simply her courage, but her humanity. She was not a conqueror seeking glory, nor a ruler protecting privilege. She was a mother, a queen, and a woman wronged beyond endurance. Her uprising was as much emotional as political. It grew from personal suffering into collective rebellion, transforming private pain into public power. This combination of personal tragedy and national struggle gives her legend its lasting force. She reminds the world that resistance often begins with those who have nothing left to lose. In comparing her with queens like Hatshepsut, a pattern emerges that defines the very nature of forgotten or misrepresented power. Hatshepsut used persuasion and divine imagery to build her authority within an established system. Boudica denied that possibility, turned instead to destruction, wielding fire as both weapon and message. Both women challenged the boundaries set by their worlds. Both revealed how gender and power collide within the structures of history. One built monuments that were nearly erased. The other burned cities that could never be forgotten. Their stories together reveal two faces of defiance, creation and rebellion, order and chaos, silence and flame. The world remembers Boudica not only because of what she destroyed, but because of what she represented. Her name has come to symbolize the refusal to accept injustice, the courage to stand against overwhelming odds. Each generation that rediscovers her story finds new meaning in it. To those under foreign rule, she is freedom. To those facing tyranny, she is defiance. To those silenced by power, she is the voice that refuses to fade. In this way, Her legacy continues the same thread that runs through the hidden reigns of history, the persistence of those whom the world tried to forget. Though her rebellion ended in blood, Boudica's legend became larger than the empire that sought to erase it. The Romans ruled Britain for centuries, but their empire eventually crumbled. The memory of the Iceni queen, however, survived through the collapse of kingdoms, the rise of nations, and the turning of ages. Her story stands as proof that resistance leaves traces even when power seeks to destroy them. Like Hatshepsut's temple carved into stone, Boudica's rebellion carved itself into memory, not through architecture but through myth. Both women, in their own ways, demonstrated that true power does not depend on permanence. It depends on the ability to inspire. Today, when one speaks of courage, Boudica's name stands beside the great symbols of defiance across the world. Her story has crossed borders, inspiring not only national pride but universal admiration. She belongs to every struggle against domination, every voice that rises against silence. The ashes of her burned cities may have long cooled, but the spirit that ignited them remains alive in the human imagination. She reminds us that empire is never eternal, that oppression always carries the seed of its own undoing. The serpent and the crown, symbols of rebellion and rule, merge in her story. The serpent strikes when threatened, swift and deadly. The crown commands through presence and purpose. Boudica carried both, a queen who ruled through vengeance and vision. Her life was brief, her triumphs temporary, but her legacy eternal. Through her, the echo of every silenced ruler, every erased name, and every forgotten queen finds voice again. She stands beside Hatshepsut and the countless others whose reigns shaped the world, her fire still burning across the centuries as a reminder that even when history tries to bury truth, it cannot silence those who dared to fight for it. The story of Boudica's rebellion leaves behind the image of a queen whose defiance became her weapon, whose fire burned brighter than the empire that tried to extinguish it. Yet she was not the only woman who faced the might of Rome and dared to fight it. Across deserts, palaces, and continents, others rose to challenge the same forces of empire, ambition, and expectation. Each of them, in her own way, turned history into a battleground not only of armies but of ideas. Their names do not echo as loudly as those of Caesar or Alexander, but their legacies shaped empires and outlasted conquerors. After the ashes of Boudica's Britain cooled, the world witnessed other women who matched her courage with intellect, strategy, and vision. These were warrior queens and political masterminds, leaders whose brilliance defied every boundary of their time. In the heart of the Syrian desert once stood Palmyra, a city of trade, culture, and extraordinary wealth. It was a meeting point between East and West, where caravans carried silks, spices, and ideas across vast sands. Out of this oasis rose Zenobia, one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world. She was both a scholar and a warrior, a ruler whose ambitions stretched from the sands of Arabia to the banks of the Nile. Her name, Septimia Zenobia, would come to symbolize the daring spirit of a woman who defied the most powerful empire of her age. If Cleopatra had charmed Rome, Zenobia challenged it openly, not through seduction but through intellect and command. Zenobia's rise began after the death of her husband, Odenathus, who had been the ruler of Palmyra and a loyal ally of Rome. When he was assassinated, she assumed the regency for her young son, Vabalithus. At first, she maintained the appearance of loyalty to the empire, governing in the emperor's name. Yet beneath the surface of diplomacy, she began to build something greater. The Roman Empire, weakened by internal strife and external threats, was no longer the invincible power it once had been. Zenobia saw in this chaos an opportunity, not merely to survive, but to create a new Eastern Empire. Where others saw danger, she saw destiny. She expanded Palmyra's influence with remarkable speed and precision. Her armies marched across neighboring provinces, bringing much of the East under her control. Egypt, long a jewel in Rome's crown, fell to her forces. By the time her power reached its height, she ruled a domain that stretched from the borders of Anatolia to the Red Sea. Yet Zenobia's strength was not only military. She understood the power of culture and identity. She presented herself as both a Roman and an Eastern monarch, blending traditions to appeal to the diverse peoples under her rule. Fluent in several languages, she surrounded herself with philosophers and scholars. She was said to be as comfortable discussing Plato as leading her generals. In a world that viewed women as adornments to power, she became its architect. Zenobia's rule was marked by both vision and audacity. She declared her independence from Rome, adopting imperial titles for herself and her son. To the Romans, this was rebellion. To her subjects, it was liberation. Her court became a symbol of Eastern Renaissance, a place where Greek, Persian, and Arab influences coexisted in harmony. Palmyra flourished as a cultural beacon, even as it prepared for war. For a brief moment in history, Zenobia's empire stood as an equal to Rome, proof that power could exist beyond its shadow. But empires rarely tolerate rivals. When Emperor Aurelian took power, he moved swiftly to reclaim the lost provinces. His legions advanced with ruthless efficiency, pushing back Zenobia's forces. Despite her courage and strategic brilliance, she faced an enemy with greater resources and a singular obsession with restoring Roman dominance. The decisive confrontation came near the city of Emesa, where her army was defeated. Zenobia fled toward the Euphrates, hoping to seek aid from the Persians, but she was captured before crossing the river. Her empire collapsed, and Palmyra was brought to its knees. The Romans paraded Zenobia through the streets of Rome in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph. Yet even as a captive, she refused to be humiliated. Ancient writers describe her walking with dignity, her bearing that of a queen rather than a prisoner. Some accounts say Aurelian, impressed by her composure, spared her life and allowed her to live in comfort. Whether she died in exile or lived on as a noblewoman in Italy remains uncertain. What is clear is that her legend endured. Zenobia became a symbol of intelligence, independence, and resilience. A woman who challenged empire not through mere defiance, but through the creation of a vision larger than herself. Her story stands as a bridge between East and West, a reminder that greatness often blooms in the margins of empire. While Zenobia fought Rome on the eastern frontier, another queen confronted it from the south. Amanirenas of Kush, the one-eyed ruler of a kingdom that lay along the Nile in what is now Sudan, stood as one of the few monarchs in history to face Rome in battle and win. The kingdom of Kush had a long and proud heritage, once ruling Egypt itself during the age of the Black Pharaohs. By the time Rome expanded into Africa, Kush remained a strong and independent power. When Augustus, the first emperor, claimed Egypt as part of his empire, he sought to extend Roman influence deeper into the continent. But Amanirenas would not be subdued. The conflict began when Roman forces advanced into Kushite territory, seeking tribute and submission. In response, Amanirenas gathered her armies and struck back. Her warriors, skilled in archery and desert warfare, invaded southern Egypt and captured several Roman outposts. They even took statues of the emperor and brought them back to Kush as trophies, a bold act that spoke louder than any declaration. Her leadership was fierce and direct. Legends tell that she lost one of her eyes in battle, but continued to fight undaunted. Her courage inspired her people, and her tactical skill confounded the Roman commanders who underestimated her resolve. When Rome retaliated, the war turned brutal. The legions, hardened by years of conquest, pushed deep into Kush. Yet Amanirenas refused to yield. She adopted a strategy of attrition, drawing the Romans into harsh terrain where supply lines faltered. Her forces used their knowledge of the desert to their advantage, striking swiftly and disappearing before the enemy could regroup. The campaign dragged on, and neither side could claim total victory. Eventually, both powers sought peace. Amanirenas personally led negotiations with the Roman envoys, securing terms that favored her kingdom. Kush retained its independence, and Rome agreed to withdraw its garrisons from the contested lands. It was an extraordinary outcome, a treaty between equals, not conqueror and conquered. The significance of Amanirenas' triumph extends beyond military success. It demonstrated that even in an age dominated by empire, resistance could prevail through intelligence and will. Rome respected her enough to record the treaty without embellishment, an acknowledgement of her strength. Her story also challenges the perception of African history as passive under external power. The kingdom of Kush, under her leadership, proved that civilization and sovereignty thrived far beyond the Mediterranean world. Her reign left behind monuments, inscriptions, and legends that speak of a queen who ruled not through subservience, but through pride and skill. Her defiance ensured that Kush remained a force to be reckoned with for generations after her death. If Zenobia and Amanirenas represent defiance against Rome from different frontiers, another woman rose far to the east, in a land whose imperial grandeur eclipsed even that of the Caesars. In China, during the Tang dynasty, Wu Zetian ascended from the lowest rank of concubine to the highest throne in the empire. Her journey from servant to sovereign remains one of the most extraordinary political transformations in history. Where Boudica fought oppression with fire, and Zenobia built a rival empire through intellect, Wu Zetian mastered the machinery of power itself. She understood that influence was not merely seized on the battlefield, but constructed within the invisible structures of court and bureaucracy. Wu Zetian entered the palace of Emperor Taizong as a concubine, one among many. After his death, she was expected to retire into a convent, as tradition demanded. But Wu was not content to fade into obscurity. She returned to the court under the next emperor, Gaozong, and soon became his favored consort. Her intelligence, political acumen, and ability to read people set her apart. In a court where intrigue was as deadly as war, she proved unmatched in her command of strategy. When Gaozong's health declined, she effectively took over the duties of rulership, issuing decrees and managing affairs of state. Upon his death, she moved to secure power for herself, first as Empress Dowager, then as regent, and finally as emperor in her own right, the only woman in Chinese history to hold that title. Her rule transformed the empire. Wu Zetian strengthened the central government, promoted officials based on merit rather than lineage, and expanded the empire's influence beyond its borders. She supported education, encouraged Buddhism, and commissioned works of literature and art. Her reign was marked by stability and prosperity. Yet her power came at a price. To maintain control, she eliminated rivals and navigated constant plots against her. Male historians of later dynasties, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman on the throne, depicted her as ruthless and immoral. They emphasized scandal over accomplishment, portraying her ambition as monstrous rather than magnificent. But behind these distortions lies a truth that cannot be erased. Wu Zetian ruled effectively, and her leadership secured one of the most dynamic periods in Chinese history. Her story illustrates a different kind of power than that of warriors or conquerors. Wu Zetian's strength lay in her mastery of systems, bureaucracy, ideology, and narrative. She did not destroy the structures of empire. She mastered them so completely that they bent to her will. Like Hatshepsut before her, she used religious symbolism to justify her rule, presenting herself as the chosen one of heaven. She commissioned temples and inscriptions that celebrated her as the embodiment of divine order. Yet unlike Hatshepsut, who built her legitimacy through divine birth, Wu Zetian built hers through performance and achievement. Every policy, every reform, every public act was part of a larger narrative of destiny fulfilled. Her rule was not an interruption in China's imperial tradition, but an expansion of it, proving that leadership could transcend gender if backed by ability. Together, these women, Zenobia, Amanirenas, and Wu Zetian, form a triad of power that spans the ancient world. They lived in different cultures, spoke different languages, and ruled through different means, yet they shared a common defiance of limitation. Each rose in a world that told her she could not rule, and each answered not with words but with deeds. Zenobia built an empire of intellect and ambition. Amanirenas defended a kingdom through courage and cunning. Wu Zetian mastered an empire through intellect and reform. They remind us that history is not defined solely by those who conquered the most land, but by those who reshaped what power itself could mean. Their stories also reveal how easily greatness can be hidden or distorted. Zenobia's empire was reduced to a footnote in Roman history. Amanirenas' triumph was buried in the sands of Africa. Wu Zetian's reign was turned into a moral warning by those who feared her example. Yet time has a way of restoring balance. Modern historians, archaeologists, and readers have begun to re-examine these figures, stripping away the layers of prejudice that once obscured them. In doing so, they rediscover not only individuals but possibilities, the idea that leadership, intelligence, and courage are not bound by gender or geography. From Hatshepsut's temples to Boudica's battlefield, from Zenobia's empire to Amanirenas' victory and Wu Zetian's throne, the thread of hidden power runs unbroken. Each of these women fought, in her own way, against the silence imposed by history. Some did so with swords, others with laws or symbols. They were queens, generals, scholars, and reformers, but above all, they were human beings who refused to accept the limits set upon them. Their legacies continue to challenge the old story of history as a chronicle of men and empires. They remind us that behind every monument and manuscript lies another story, waiting to be told. To remember them is not merely to honor the past, but to correct it. It is to recognize that power wears many faces and speaks in many voices. These women did not seek permission to lead. They led because necessity demanded it. And though empires rose and fell, their influence endured, carried forward in legend, art, and memory. They stand not only as examples of female strength, but as proof of the enduring truth that the capacity to rule, to create, and to inspire belongs to no single kind of person. It belongs to all who dare to claim it. In their triumphs and their tragedies, these queens and empresses left behind a legacy greater than any empire, a legacy of courage that transcends time, a call to remember what power truly is when it is guided by vision rather than fear. From the deserts of Palmyra to the valleys of the Nile and the palaces of Tang, China, their stories whisper the same enduring truth. That history, though written by conquerors, is lived and shaped by those brave enough to challenge them. The stories of Hatshepsut, Boudica, Zenobia, Amanirenas, and Wu Zetian linger in memory, not only because they changed the worlds they lived in, but because they continue to echo in ours. Each of these women stood in defiance of the boundaries that confined them, rewriting the rules of power with intellect, strength, and vision. They remind us that history is not only about those who conquered lands, but also about those who conquered silence. Their legacies reach into the present, urging us to ask how far the world has truly come in recognizing leadership in all its forms, and who still remains hidden behind the curtain of history. When we look at modern leadership, we often imagine it as a balance between authority and empathy, between strategy and humanity. These are qualities long celebrated in men, but often questioned in women. Yet the queens and empresses of the ancient world embodied them long before the language of equality was even imagined. Hatshepsut ruled through reason and vision, choosing trade and construction over war, showing that power could be measured in creation rather than destruction. Boudica turned pain into defiance, leading through passion and conviction. Zenobia combined intellect with diplomacy, a strategist who saw empire not as conquest, but as harmony between cultures. Amanirenas fought to preserve her people's dignity, proving that resistance could coexist with grace. Wu Zetian built her power not on rebellion but on mastery of order, reforming a vast empire through insight and will. Each of them reflects the many faces of leadership that continue to shape conversations today. In every era, leadership has been judged by the standards of the dominant culture. In theirs, women were not supposed to command armies, issue decrees, or carve their likeness into stone. Power was expected to be masculine, decisive, and distant. Yet these rulers showed that power could also be intellectual, nurturing, and visionary. Their strength did not erase their identity as women. It expanded the meaning of what leadership could be. Modern discussions about gender and power often circle the same themes they lived: recognition, equality, and the right to define one's own role. The question that haunted them still remains: who gets to decide who leads? The persistence of their stories proves that leadership cannot be confined by gender. When Hatshepsut wore the false beard of a pharaoh, she was not pretending to be a man. She was claiming her right to embody authority as it was defined. When Wu Zetian declared herself emperor, she was not erasing her womanhood, but proving that the throne was not limited to one sex. They used the symbols of power available to them, not as disguise but as language. Their choices reveal the cost of existing in systems that did not imagine them as rulers, and the creativity required to navigate those systems without being destroyed by them. Modern leaders, whether in politics, business, or culture, still confront these same dilemmas. They balance expectation against authenticity, perception against action. The double standard that questions women's authority or motives when they hold power is not new. It is as old as the temples of Thebes and the palaces of Chang'an. Yet the stories of these ancient women offer a counterpoint to those doubts. They show that competence, vision, and courage have no gender. Hatshepsut's monuments still stand because she built with purpose. Boudica's fire still burns in legend because she fought with conviction. Zenobia's city still fascinates historians because she imagined an empire of diversity. Amanirenas' treaty still stands as an example of negotiation between equals. Wu Zetian's reforms still shape how China remembers its golden age. Each of them left a mark not because they were exceptions, but because they embodied the possibilities that exist when power is redefined rather than merely seized. The silence that followed many of their reigns is as revealing as their achievements. Each of them was in some way erased or diminished by those who came after. Their absence from the standard narratives of history speaks to a deeper question about how memory itself is constructed. Who writes history, and for whom is it written? The victors record their triumphs, but often omit those who do not fit their image of power. The disappearance of women like Hatshepsut or the vilification of Wu Zetian shows that even the greatest accomplishments can be buried under centuries of prejudice. It is not enough to tell their stories as curiosities from a distant past. Their erasure must be understood as a pattern, a deliberate act of forgetting that continues in subtler forms even today. When we examine textbooks, museums, or media, we find the same imbalance. Men dominate the list of inventors, rulers, and thinkers, while women appear as side notes or exceptions. This imbalance shapes how society defines potential. If young girls grow up seeing leadership as male, they are told indirectly that ambition is unnatural for them. If boys grow up seeing compassion or diplomacy as feminine, they are taught that strength must come at the expense of empathy. The stories of these ancient rulers challenge both distortions. They remind us that leadership can be multifaceted, that creation, courage, and wisdom can coexist in the same person, regardless of gender. Understanding their stories in today's context invites us to reconsider what progress truly means. Equality is not achieved by inserting a few names into history's margins, but by reshaping the way we tell the story itself. It means looking at the past not as a series of isolated heroes, but as a network of forgotten voices. It means acknowledging that greatness is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it is hidden, silenced, or rewritten by those threatened by it. The recovery of these women's histories is not an act of nostalgia. It is a correction, a restoration of balance that helps us understand what leadership has always been capable of. Each of these rulers faced resistance not only from enemies, but from the assumptions of their own societies. Hatshepsut's image was chiseled out of monuments because her success as a woman ruler unsettled the narrative of male dominance. Zenobia's brilliance was reduced to exoticism by Roman chroniclers. Amanirenas' victory was forgotten because her kingdom did not fit into the Roman or European framework of civilization. Wu Zetian's reforms were overshadowed by accusations of cruelty written by men who feared her legacy. Their experiences remind us that the act of leading while female has always been revolutionary. The backlash against them mirrors the subtle biases that still persist today, where women in authority are scrutinized not for their decisions, but for their demeanor. The lessons these women left behind are not confined to gender. They speak to the very nature of power, how it is gained, used, and remembered. Hatshepsut teaches that leadership grounded in vision outlasts conquest. Boudica teaches that injustice, when met with courage, can transform oppression into unity. Zenobia shows that intellect and diplomacy can rival brute force. Amanirenas proves that dignity can stand against domination and win. Wu Zetian demonstrates that systems of power can be mastered, not merely resisted. Together, their legacies form a map of power that transcends time and place. In our modern world, where discussions of leadership often revolve around charisma or dominance, their stories urge us to consider another dimension, purpose. They led not for personal glory but for the survival, dignity, or advancement of their people. Even when their methods were contested, their intentions were deeply human. Their reigns remind us that true power is not measured by control, but by contribution, by what is built, protected, or changed for the better. Their echoes reach into every movement that seeks justice, equality, or recognition. The fight for representation in politics, the push for balance in workplaces, the demand for fairness in storytelling, all find their roots in the same struggle these women faced. When a young leader today challenges expectations, when a voice once silenced insists on being heard, the spirit of these ancient queens lives on. They prove that leadership could emerge from defiance, intellect, or compassion, and that it does not require permission to exist. The modern world has the tools to recover their stories more fully than ever before. Archaeology, digital archives, and global scholarship allow forgotten histories to resurface. But rediscovery alone is not enough. These stories must be shared, discussed, and taught, not as isolated wonders, but as integral parts of human history. Every classroom, museum, and conversation that includes Hatshepsut alongside Ramses, Wu Zetian alongside Confucius, Zenobia alongside Caesar, restores a missing piece of humanity's story. It challenges the assumption that greatness follows only one pattern. It is time to look at history not as a collection of monuments to power, but as a living dialogue about what power means. When we study figures like these, we are not just learning about their world. We are holding a mirror to our own. Their triumphs and their silences reveal how far we have come and how far we still must go. For every Hatshepsut or Wu Zetian remembered, there are countless others still waiting to be found, queens, generals, thinkers, and reformers whose names were erased or never recorded at all. The effort to recover them is an act of justice, not only for the past but for the future. Every time we tell their stories, we challenge the old narrative that confined power to a single gender or geography. We make history more complete, more honest, and more reflective of the truth that humanity's achievements are shared. These women's lives remind us that power can be both fierce and creative, both visionary and grounded in care. Their leadership was not about dominance but about purpose, not about fear but about faith in themselves, their people, and the worlds they sought to build. As we listen to their echoes, we are reminded that remembrance is itself a form of resistance. The act of telling their stories keeps them alive, defying the centuries of silence imposed upon them. It also forces us to ask what other names are still missing from our collective memory. Who were the rulers, poets, inventors, or philosophers whose work was lost because it did not fit the accepted pattern? What other legacies lie buried beneath the sands of time, waiting for someone to ask the right question? The search for forgotten histories is never finished. It is a continuous effort to reclaim the full scope of human experience. The challenge is not only to remember but to act, to share, to question, and to expand the way we see power. By recognizing these women, we create space for new stories, new perspectives, and new understandings of leadership. Their courage becomes a standard against which we measure our own. Their resilience becomes a lesson in how to lead through adversity. Their wisdom becomes a reminder that power, when guided by purpose, can transform rather than destroy. The next step belongs to all who hear their stories. Tell them again, not as legends of the distant past, but as truths that belong to the present. Share them with those who believe leadership must look or sound a certain way. Let their lives inspire new conversations about what it means to rule, to resist, and to create. And most importantly, seek out the voices still missing from history, the queens, generals, and thinkers who remain unnamed. The past is not a closed book, it is a living conversation. By adding these names back into it, we reshape our understanding of what humanity has been and what it can still become. The world remembers emperors and conquerors because they built monuments of stone. These women built monuments of meaning, and those endure far longer. Every retelling keeps their light burning, guiding us toward a more complete vision of history. Their echoes are not fading. They are growing louder in every story that refuses to be silenced. So listen closely, share their tales, and continue the search for others like them. The future of history depends on those who refuse to let the past be told in half.